Well, thank you. It's an honor to be here today. And I'm actually still trying to wrap my mind around the fact that I'm a walking blob of bacteria. And not sure what outfit's going to go with that tomorrow. But thank you for that, Dr. Federak. I'd like to acknowledge the Mississaugas of New Credit, whose traditional territories we are currently in at the moment. And I'd like to, again, thank the organizers for inviting me to this really important event on nutrition. I have a really ambitious presentation, but I'm glad that the presenter before me also had one, so I seen her whip through hers okay, so I think I'll be able to get through mine as well. My agenda, basically, I was asked to kind of provide an overview of Aboriginal people in Canada. My work is predominantly in Ontario, but I do also I have spent a lot of years working across Canada, so I'm very well versed in the issues affecting First Nations people across this country. So I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about who Aboriginal people are, the demographics and governance structures, specifically in Ontario, because it will give you an idea of how First Nations and Inuit and Métis people govern themselves across Canada. Talk a bit about the Aboriginal health issues and digestive health, and especially some of the digestive health-related cancers. My focus is obviously cancer. I do work with Cancer Care Ontario as the Director for Aboriginal Cancer Control, so I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about that. And I'd like to spend a bit of time talking about the issues and challenges to healthy nutrition. And I will highlight one program that the federal government currently has underway, just to give you an idea of some of the work that's being done in that area. I'll also end by talking a bit about our Aboriginal cancer strategy that was recently launched just in June. It's this document here, and I do have copies available for people who are interested on the table to the side there. So who are Aboriginal people? Aboriginal people are the original inhabitants of Canada. The Constitution Act of 1982 protects Aboriginal people's treaty and inherent rights. It recognized that Aboriginal people are the First Nations, Indian, which is a term we've never liked. We prefer First Nation in Canada. In the US, they prefer Native American. It also recognizes the Inuit and the Métis peoples. So these are the three constitutionally recognized Aboriginal peoples in Canada. In terms of population, these are based on the 2006 census. There's about 1.1. It's probably a bit higher now if we look at the current census data, but I didn't have access to that. There's probably 1.2 million First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people in Canada. Most of that population is comprised of First Nations. I believe the census data is very conservative because many of our First Nation communities don't participate in the census, so this is a pretty good benchmark, but it certainly isn't the whole story. In Ontario, one of the things the census likes to highlight is the fact that so many First Nations or Aboriginal people live on and off reserve, and some of you may have heard that. In Ontario, there are close to 800,000 First Nations, Métis and Inuit people, but one of the problems with saying that 80% of Aboriginal people live off reserve is that when the federal government starts to talk about resources, they apply those resources to off reserve Aboriginal folks, and the communities are not getting the resources that they really need to address some of their really critical issues. The truth is that it's closer to when the census is 70 to 80%, what they're talking about is all Aboriginal people, and Inuit and Métis people do not have reserves. So they're measured into that. Whereas First Nations, many First Nations still live on reserve, and in Ontario it's closer to 60% living on and 40% living off. I myself maintain a home in my community. Many of us who work off our communities do have homes in our communities. We come off because we have to go to work, to go to school, but our communities are still very much our home base. In terms of the population across Canada, as you can see, Ontario has the highest population, with BC next. In Ontario, there are about 133 First Nations. In BC, there's over 200, but some of them are quite small. And as you look at this chart here, you'll see most of the higher populated provinces are out west. It's hard to talk about who Aboriginal people are without talking about some of their political and governance structures. I could spend a day talking to you about the political and governance structures of Aboriginal people across Canada, so I'm going to choose to stick to Ontario. In Ontario, as I mentioned, there are 133 First Nations. And this top line here, the 133 First Nations, we have a secretariat office called the Chiefs of Ontario. But along with that, we also have political territorial organizations, and those are the organizations on this side, on that side. The four political territorial organizations make up the bulk of the communities, and they're set up that way because before the government came along and started to segregate us and put us onto First Nation communities, we actually had very vibrant political organizations. We knew how to govern ourselves. We had our own methods of organizing ourselves and relating to each other. And the four political territorial organizations still do that. So NAN, which is called the Anishinaabe Nation, has 49 member First Nations. The Unit of Ontario Indians, which is also called the Anishinaabe Nation, it has 42 member nations. Grand Council Treaty 3 has 29. 2 of their member nations are actually in Manitoba. But you have to realize we didn't draw those boundary lines. The Association of Iroquois and Allied Indians has 8, and there are also independent and unaffiliated First Nations, and there's about 12 of those. Then we have tribal councils, and these are smaller groupings of First Nations that come together to deal with issues of mutual interest, and usually these are political issues. And then we have the First Nation themselves, who have chiefs and councils. If you go across the top line, we have the Tungasoo-Swingat Inuit, who are in Ottawa, the Métis Nation of Ontario, the Ontario Native Women's Association, and the Ontario Federation of Indian Friendship Centers. In total, there are about 9 provincial-level organizations that I work with in order to do the work that I do with Cancer Care Ontario. And each of these organizations have governance structures and members that belong to them that help to support their initiatives and that these organizations represent in terms of health issues, social issues, economic issues, you name it, they are covering everything. Just to give you an idea of where many of the communities are, in Northern Ontario, many of our communities are in rural or remote areas. I have done a lot of work with some of our remote communities, and to give you an idea of some of the challenges that these communities have, for me to travel from Toronto to Sandy Lake First Nation, which is one of the blue dots at the top of the province there, it's about $2,000 to $2,500 there and back. And that's not even leaving the province. So for these communities to travel in and out of their communities for health care, whatever services, or to get services to them is a real challenge. A lot of people say, well, why don't they leave? Would you leave your home? Why should our people leave their homes? These are their home territories. This is where their ancestors are buried. This is where their history is. So no, they're not going to leave their homes. But it makes it challenging for us to actually develop the kind of services that we need to in order to better meet their needs, because they have very real needs up there. In Southern Ontario, even though we don't have as many of the communities, and this is a depiction of the Métis and the First Nation and the Inuit. The Inuit are predominantly located in Ottawa, but the communities are bigger. Six Nations First Nation, for example, has 20,000 people. It's one of the largest First Nation communities in Canada. So many of the First Nations in the southern part of the province are larger, and a lot of the smaller ones are located in the north and northwest. In terms of issues, and some of these slides I think were already covered by some of the earlier presenters, but we know that there's some real challenges when it comes to nutrition, and this data comes from the Canadian Community Health Survey and the Regional Health Survey that First Nations themselves led. But approximately 64% of First Nations living off reserve eat less than recommended. The recommended, nutritional. If you look at the Good Health Eating Guide, that doesn't even apply to communities. There's no way they can actually meet that because, and I'll go through some of those issues in a minute. This is even higher for the Inuit. Only 78% eat less than the recommended servings. 61% of Métis. First Nations on reserve, 30%. But again, I think these are very conservative because, as I said, a lot of the communities don't participate in these surveys. So this is really just to give you an idea that there are issues out there around these. Smoking. Approximately 35% of First Nations living off reserve smoke, 57% on reserve smoke. I have a program that's called the Aboriginal Tobacco Program, and I have 2 Aboriginal Tobacco-wise leads. One works out of the north in Thunder Bay, one works in the south out of Barrie. And again, just to show that we can't always go by what we see in the written because, as I say, it's not always a very good, because so many of the communities don't participate. It gives us a good idea of the issues, but it certainly doesn't give us the whole picture. But my leads will talk to communities, and smoking rates in some communities are as high as 80 and 90%. I mean, this is very alarming because it's one of the ways that they cope with some of the other issues, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We know that the Inuit have some of the highest smoking rates in Canada, and we know that youth smoking rates among all 3 populations are very high compared to the rest of Canada and especially the rest of Ontario. Chronic conditions. I sometimes think that it's easier to say when it comes to chronic conditions, we have them all. But for the purposes of this gathering, we have broken it out a bit. But the prevalence of chronic conditions is very high among First Nation people off reserve, 71%, Métis 74%, and non-Aboriginal Canadians is about 64%. 63% of First Nation adults have at least one chronic health condition. In Canada, we know that diabetes is an epidemic amongst First Nations. 75% of First Nations are infected with H. pylori, and First Nations are 1 to 2 times more likely to develop digestive disorders as a result. Physical activity, it goes without saying. This is a real issue because you have to realize that First Nations, prior to the 1950s and 60s, were very active. Many of them still maintained trap lines. Many of them still lived off the land in their communities. And when that changed, when the fur trade died out, when they could no longer support their families by doing the things that they've done in the past, they got very sedentary. Their diets changed. And I think a lot of the information that was provided earlier kind of established the fact that if you're going to be sedentary and your diet's going to change and you're going to eat more processed food because that's all you can afford, you're going to get obese and you're not going to want to do stuff. So this is what we're seeing in our communities. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that they cannot maintain their lifestyles that they were accustomed to. And this is something that we're trying to address by looking at other ways that they can continue to be active and introducing things that they can still do in their communities. As I said, obesity, 66% of First Nations off reserve are obese, 74% of Inuit are obese, but again, I think that number is a bit conservative. As a result of these problems, we know that some of the digestive health-related cancers are certainly going to be there. Stomach, esophageal, colorectal, pancreatic, gallbladder, liver, and we do see this. But when it comes to cancer in First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people, we know that it's rising across all 3 of the nations, but specifically First Nations. First Nations are certainly seeing an increase in breast cancer. Colorectal cancer in First Nation men has actually surpassed the mainstream prevalence rates for Ontario. Lung cancer rates for Inuit men are the highest in the country. And we know that most of the First Nations and the Métis and Inuit are being diagnosed with later stage cancers, so as a result, their chances of survival are greatly compromised. Some of the issues and challenges to healthy nutrition, and I alluded to some of these a second ago, but because of the distance, accessibility, it's very difficult to access a healthy diet when you don't have anywhere to get it, especially if you're in a remote community or even one of our rural communities. The high costs associated with buying these foods, especially up north, and I'm going to show you some pictures in a minute. Transportation and distance to even get the foods up to some of our communities is often a problem. Then we have the jurisdictional issues. First Nation communities, a lot of them, all of them, are a federal responsibility. So then you have the province and the Fed saying, well, I'm not going to do anything about that because that's your job. And the province saying, well, no, we're not going to do anything because that's your job. So in the meantime, nothing gets done. Traditional practices, as I mentioned, it's very difficult for our communities to even go out and hunt and gather anymore because the high cost of gasoline for snowmobiles, the high cost of ammunition for rifles, and they simply don't have this because many of the communities have a lot of acute poverty. The lack and limited resource capacity for them to actually go out and make a difference. Some of the communities in the remote or north are trying to look at things like industrial-sized greenhouses. If we can't bring it in, why can't we grow it here? But they need support to do that. And some of them are looking at ways to generate that support so they can develop these greenhouses and start growing their own produce. Processed food is a huge problem. It's one of the only foods that communities can afford. So they're eating a lot of boxed foods, a lot of packaged foods, a lot of unhealthy foods, a lot of fast foods like chips and sodas. Like I say, the sodas and powdered drinks are being consumed a lot. Water, because of water safety issues, a lot of the communities are under water boiling alerts. So some of the water is not safe to drink. So this is an alternative. So there's a lot of these issues that affect the communities in terms of being able to maintain healthy nutrition. The other issues are just as important. These social determinants of health, as I mentioned, there's a lot of poverty in the communities, low education levels, limited economic opportunities. And this isn't because they want to be there. Basically, it goes back to our treaties. We signed treaties with this country. This country was ours. We made treaties to share and live in harmony with our neighbors, with the people that came here. And those treaties set out very specific rules of how we're going to do that, but it also set out how we're going to share in the wealth of this country. The federal government has seemed to have forgotten about the wealth part because they continue to not honor the treaties and not let our communities develop the resource base that they need to have the economic development opportunities that they want to have to support and sustain themselves. And that's an issue that's probably going to be ongoing for a while, but it's one that we're making some small headway on. The intergenerational trauma as a result of a lot of the oppressive activities of the federal government. Colonialism, the Indian Act, which is still in place today. And the Indian Act is actually, in Africa, the tripartite, when they developed their oppressive policies, they based those on the Indian Act in Canada. And the Indian Act is still in place today. It still governs how we run our communities. It's still used to keep us in line, so to speak. We also have the residential schools, and some of you may have heard of the residential schools, but there was a policy in Canada at one time to take First Nation children from their parents and put them into schools so that they could kill the Indian in them, was essentially what they wanted to do. And these kids were as young as 4 and 5 years old, and they were taken away until they were 16, 18 years old. So they lost their sense of identity, they lost their language, they lost their sense of culture, they lost their sense of having any idea of how to be a parent themselves because they had no idea of parenting. And this is intergenerational. This is passed on to the next generation and the next. My grandmother was a residential school survivor, and I know well what that did to her and how it affected my mother and how it affected us. So these are the things that we've had to deal with, and this policy went on until 1996, before the last residential school was closed. So a lot of these things have lent themselves to creating the environments we see in our communities. But I can assure you that First Nation people are very perseverant, and there's a very strong spirit there to survive because we've had to. And that spirit is still alive and well, and that is something that we know is going to keep us going to deal with the challenges that we have ahead of us. As a result, though, of the extreme challenges that we've had over the years, the communities have developed unhealthy coping behaviors, and that's probably what you see a lot of in the papers, because the media likes to focus in on that stuff. We do know that there's a lot of drug and alcohol abuse, there's a lot of youth suicide, and there's a lot of coping mechanisms that they just are trying to do whatever they can to deal with the environments that they find themselves into, whether it's poverty, whether it's being in a remote community and not having access, but there's still that flicker, as I said, of communities that are doing things to address those issues. We certainly don't want these issues to be addressed for us. Every community would like to address these issues for themselves, but we can't do that alone because we didn't get there alone. Anyway, this all come to play in terms of where communities are at today. And the same holds true for the Métis and the Inuit. In terms of a program that's been in place to address some of these issues, the Federal Nutrition Program, they developed, the Health Canada developed a program called the Nutrition North Canada. It was effective on April 12. It's actually just been revamped. It was revamped in April of 2011, and it replaced the Food Mail Program. And the Food Mail Program sounds as nutritious as it's as nutritious as it sounds. How would you like to get your food mailed to you? Can you imagine what shape that would be in? Well, that's the case of the Food Mail Program, and this was for remote First Nation communities. That's how they got some of their nutritious food. It started in the 1960s, and Canada Post would essentially transport parcels of food to these communities. It was the new revamped program is not available across Canada, and there is such a need out there, because I just mentioned in Ontario alone we have over 30 remote communities, but across Canada there are 135, and that's just the remote ones. There are other rural communities that have equal challenges when it comes to access. So one of the challenges, as I mentioned, around this process is perishable foods don't transport well. You don't want to be eating that lettuce after it's been through the mail for 2 weeks, let me tell you. And as a result, it really limited the variety and the quantity of foods that could be mailed. And even with a reduction in cost, because they did a cost-sharing agreement with Canada Post, it's still extremely expensive to mail anything to the communities. Just to give you an example of some of the costs we're talking about, and I don't know if you can see this that well, but for a 10-pound bag of potatoes, it's over $21. And this is in just one of the northern stores in one of the remote communities. And then we have the Activia yogurt. A tub of it is almost $7. And Silhouette, $12.49. And, these are the prices. And these are, some of the choices that they have up there. But because folks can't afford to buy these things, a lot of them don't go used because they just can't afford to buy them. Bananas, $5.69. Apples, $8.09. Then we have the lettuce, spring mix, $8.25. Ginger root, $12.99. And this, if you walk through one of the northern stores in one of the remote communities, you would probably be appalled at some of the other costs. And this is the formula for babies, $156. So, a lot of our young moms are certainly breastfeeding more and probably that's their first choice. But, we have young moms or moms that sometimes their milk doesn't come in, and this is not an option. So as a result, these children are, at risk. So what are we doing about it? Basically, the Aboriginal Cancer Strategy that was recently launched in 2000 and was on June 25th of this year. As I say, my focus is cancer. I would get overwhelmed if I tried to take on every issue that we have within the First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. So I believe we have to be very focused because there are other programs out there dealing with some of these issues. But in terms of the work that we're doing, We have 6 strategic priorities, and the first is really building a productive relationship with the First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people. Often what's happened in the past with programs is, there have been a lot of very well-intentioned individuals who have wanted to try to do something to address some of the issues that I've just shared with you. And that's not a bad thing. But it's always been the approach to doing it, because what's often happened in the past is an organization or a government will develop a program thinking this should do it and say, here's your program. With no talk, no consultation, no engagement with the community, just hand it off to them and say, there you go, and that should fix things. Well, as you can well believe, that doesn't go over so well. How would you like somebody coming to you and ramming something down your throat and saying, there you go, now quit complaining, that's your program? And this has been a process that they've had in place for a lot of years, and it's still in place in many instances to this day. In order to really have a program or approach that works, you really have to have that engagement with the groups directly. I showed you the picture of our political governance structures in Ontario. I spent 18 months working with each of those 9 provincial level organizations, the First Nations, the Inuit, the Métis, and the off-reserve groups, having that conversation and saying, we do need the strategy because we know cancer is a problem, and getting their input into what was going to make the most sense. And the first pillar, the foundational pillar to getting this work forward is actually to developing that relationship. So we are working to develop that relationship. We're working to formalize that relationship with each of the nations through provincial relationship protocol agreements. And basically what they will do is they will help us to be held accountable for the work that we're committing to in this strategy. So the groups can truly feel they have a sense of ownership to this process and to the work that we're doing. And they have. They're very supportive as we move forward, because I go back to them every time I need them to input into the process and have that conversation again, have that engagement. And does it take long? Yes, it does. But at the end of the day, you're going to have a better product, and you're going to have a stronger product because you will have them as a part of that process. Research and surveillance are very important to the work that Cancer Care Ontario does, and it's certainly very important to the work that we're doing under the Aboriginal Cancer Strategy. We recognize that there's a real need for data. As I mentioned, we have the census, we have the Regional Health Survey, we have the Canadian Community Health Survey, but a lot of these surveys don't really capture the real picture because, as I mentioned, a lot of the First Nations, Inuit and Métis folks don't participate in those. And a reason for that is because a lot of times the government have used that information against them. They've been burnt far too often that they're very, very suspicious of those types of things, and so they tread very carefully when it comes to participating. So we're looking at ways to generate the kind of data that we need to help inform the programs that we have underway when it comes to increasing participation rates to screening. When it comes to looking at the need for what we're going to be doing when it comes to prevention. We have a very active program for tobacco, but we have to start looking at nutrition. We have to start looking at physical activity and alcohol. And we need to have some baseline data that's going to help inform us as we move forward. So we're looking at a number of different initiatives, and a lot of them are very creative because everybody that ever had cancer is in the Ontario Cancer Registry, including First Nations, Inuit and Métis people, but we just don't know who they are in that. So one of the projects that we're working on right now with the Chiefs of Ontario, which is that Secretariat Office organization I showed you a second ago, is to access the Indian Registry from INAC, or which is now ANAC, the Aboriginal Indian and Northern Affairs Department of the federal government, and link it to the Ontario Cancer Registry so that we'll have a better picture of where we are at right now with cancer. This surveillance work was done about 10 years ago by Dr. Lorraine Merritt, and it gave us the information that actually created the Aboriginal Cancer Control Unit in Cancer Care Ontario. So we need to see where that picture is now. So that's one example. And we know moving forward that we're going to be looking at that in a bigger way because we need to have that information across the province, and not only for First Nations, but for Inuit and Métis people. As I mentioned, prevention is going to be a huge focus. We have a very robust Aboriginal tobacco program with the 2 leads that I mentioned, but we want to expand that work to start looking at addressing some of the healthy physical activity and nutrition issues that we talked about a second ago, but also alcohol. We have recognized that, when it comes to the prevention of cancer, we have to do the same things for cancer as we do for diabetes, and that's an opportunity for us because First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people are actually very well versed in diabetes because there's been a lot of work that's been done around diabetes over the last 20 years. As I mentioned, screening. We are going to be promoting a province-wide screening blitz for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in this province. And we have a number of initiatives underway to help inform that. We have this program through the Integrated Cancer Screening Program that CCO runs and administers called the Under and Never Screened. We do know that as terms of under and never screened people in this province, that would certainly mean the Aboriginal people because they don't have access. In a lot of cases, they don't understand why they need to be screened. And they don't have family doctors who can actually refer them to screening. So we have some challenges there, but we're certainly looking at ways to address those. Supportive care is another issue, and this is palliative and supportive care. In my work, I travel around the province and I meet with a lot of the First Nation, Inuit, and Métis health tables, health councils, chiefs' tables on health. And I've often had echoed to me from a number of these different tables that when I talk about the importance of screening and the importance of making sure our people are screened because, as I said, a lot of First Nations are diagnosed with later stage cancers, and as a result, their survival is, greatly diminished. And they have always said, well, you know what, we support that. We support the need for screening. We support the need to educate people about screening and other things about cancer, but we have people with cancer right now. What is CCO doing to help us address their needs? And I think because of the gaps in services to the communities, and I mentioned the remote communities, often what happens when somebody in a remote community is diagnosed with a cancer, they just die. They won't leave because to leave means they'll never come back to their community. So rather than going for care, they just say, well, I'll just stay here and die because I'd rather die here than down there in that place where I don't know. And where is that acceptable? That a person that's their option because having access to care is not available to them. So we have to look at ways to increase our ability to address the needs of folks with cancer, whether they're in a remote community or a rural community, it shouldn't matter. And we are looking at different options to do that, but it will be a challenge. Education is a key. And to put it in the words of one of our Grand Council chiefs for one of the political territorial organizations, he said to me, Alethea, I want you to saturate my community with education and awareness of cancer. I don't want them to be afraid anymore because my people are so afraid of that word because to them it means a death sentence. And I take that to heart. So I am going to do everything I can to saturate the communities with understanding and awareness of cancer because we do have to elevate that in order to take the fear out of that word. And with that, I say Miigwech, which is thank you in Ojibwe, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you very much for a very interesting and updated talk. I travel very often into remote areas as well in different countries. And I always question how do these people, how can they afford good nutrition and how do they obtain the food that it's needed to keep their good health status. The latest one in July, I went up to Alaska, and we bump into a couple who actually teaches in a very remote area, and they only come out once a year, and they pack frozen pizzas to bring back, and I suppose that's for the school children as a treat, and they get mail order and so on. So I was wondering, do you have any data how our First Nation people here in Canada or in Ontario, the gap of services and so on compared to, say, Alaska's remote area because it's under the U.S., which is considered similar I would imagine it's a similar, what's the closest nation to ours in terms of services and stuff?
Well, the issues that you're going to see in Alaska would be the same issues you'd see in the Yukon or NWT in terms of food security. But I would like to say that, there are real efforts being made by communities themselves to look at food security issues around regaining some of the traditions that they lost when our communities were forced to go to residential schools and lost a lot of their traditional activities around food harvesting and gathering, natural indigenous foods to their communities. There are fruits, there are vegetables that they used to gather and live on. There was wild game that they lived on, which is a lot less fatty than domestic meats, I might add. And there's a resurgence of gaining that knowledge and sharing that knowledge across communities so that they can start doing some of that again. But learning about canning and freezing and drying, and a lot of that knowledge that they once had, they're starting to slowly get back again. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but as terms of Alaska, a lot of their issues are going to be similar to what you're going to see in the Yukon and the Northwest Territories, Labrador and Newfoundland.